Let's say you're ready to take on your new employee. Well, you should put a contract in place. Having said that, it's not strictly required to actually have a full contract, but there's two reasons why you should. Firstly, you need to give what's called written particulars of employment, or a Section 1 statement anyway. A Section 1 statement is a list of basic terms. They just set out the basic requirements of the employment relationship, and what's in the Section 1 statement is set out on the gov.uk website. That's the first reason. If you've got to give the written particulars anyway, why not just create a full contract? The second reason is that the contract actually tends to give the employer a bit more protection. It allows you to set out some procedures and some expectations about the relationship. So I'm going to look at some terms that you might need to put in place as part of an employment relationship. And here the basics of each of these terms is generally required to go into the Section 1 statement, but a contract gives you a chance to put a bit of flesh on the bones of the Section 1 statement. So let's look at the first one. Let's talk about pay. Obviously, the Section 1 statement will require you to set out what's being paid and when. If you have a full contract, you can set out some other benefits that might be part of the pay. You can set out some conditions for those benefits. So, for example, perhaps you give bonuses, say if fundraising targets have been met. In that case, your contract can set out the conditions for that bonus and how and when it will be paid. Let's look at another element. Let's talk about hours. So, any employee or worker for that matter will have certain limitations on the hours that they can be required to work for you. The big one is the maximum 48-hour working week. But the UK allows you to opt out of this, so an employee can be asked to agree to opt out of the 48-hour week. So you could do that in your contract or perhaps in a separate letter. There's also other limitations on working hours, like rest breaks, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. Let's look at another element. Let's talk about holiday. There's a statutory minimum holiday requirement. So employees in the UK are entitled to 28 days per year. Now, the 28 days includes the 8 statutory bank holidays. Often employers will give more than this. You can't obviously give less, but perhaps an employer might give between 25 and 28 days plus the bank holidays. What you can do in your contract is set out conditions for how and when that holiday will be taken, have procedures for how an employee requests holiday, or perhaps times when they can't take holiday. Say that you're a breast cancer charity and you don't want people to take holiday in the run-up to or during Breast Cancer Awareness Month. That's something that you could set out in your contract. Looking next then at sick pay. Employees and workers are entitled to statutory sick pay. This is set by the government, changes on a regular basis, so have a look at gov.uk for the current level of sick pay. But you could also in your contract provide for enhanced sick pay benefits. So, for example, perhaps they get higher pay or they get paid for longer than they would do under statutory sick pay. And then if you're giving those rights, well, make sure that they work for you. So in the contract, set out some conditions. Perhaps the employee has to call in sick by a certain time or produce a doctor's certificate within a certain time. That's a bit more restrictive than under the statutory scheme. Use your contract to set up a process that sets expectations and that allows you to take action if someone's taking too many sickies. Let's talk about confidentiality. Confidentiality is an important area. If you were simply to rely on your Section 1 statement, your written particulars, this wouldn't really cover it. Because even though there are implied duties on an employee to keep your confidential information confidential, those implied duties are not as extensive or as clear as what you can put in your contract. So when you're drafting your contract, think about what is confidential specific to you. Is it the contact details for your donors? Or whatever it might be. Spell that out in your contract. And then you can also set expectations should anything go wrong, say at the end of the relationship. Another area that's important is data protection. I've mentioned it a few times today. So in your contract, have an employee consent to the processing of their personal data. It doesn't have to be in the contract, but it's as good a place as any to put it, so that you are allowed to use and process any information that you need in relation to their employment. But also have them agree to keep other people's personal data confidential. And again, a contract is a good place to put that. Next, let's talk about termination. There are again implied notice periods to terminate a contract. Generally speaking, you have to give 1 week notice per year of service that the employee has with you, up to a maximum of 12 weeks. But you might wish to vary that in the contract. You can't give them less notice, but you might agree to give them more. And it's reasonably common to see employers give up to 3 months' notice, regardless of length of service. The other thing that you could do in your termination clause is set out some conditions that would amount, or some actions that would amount to gross misconduct, so that if the individual, the employee, did any of these actions, they would entitle you to terminate summarily. That means terminate without giving any notice, because what they've done is so bad for your business. In relation to termination, also think about how you're going to manage this, practically speaking. So maybe you want to require the employee to return company property in time. You might also want the option to pay in lieu of letting notice run. So if you have to give 3 months' notice, it might not be convenient to have that employee sitting in your office counting down the days. So you might want to pay them a lump sum in lieu of letting notice run, which would bring the employment relationship to an end a bit sooner. Finally, I want to talk about restrictive covenants. Again, restrictive covenants are well beyond the basics that are required in a Section 1 statement. Restrictive covenants mean that you stop an employee from unfairly competing against you after they leave your employment. So popular ones might be a non-compete clause. They can't go and work for a direct competitor. But what I think might be more relevant in a charity sector is a non-poaching clause, so that an employee who leaves can't take your staff with him or her to a new employer. Now, drafting covenants is difficult. You have to make sure they're not wider than you strictly need to protect your business interests. But if they're done right, they could be a really useful tool to keep morale and keep confidential information, as well as any important relationships, intact when somebody important leaves your business.